know what's going on. There's, you know, we approved some research as part of the mitigation component for one of the projects for KWP a while back, and they had some technical difficulties with part of the research, so they're recommending that we modify it. So there's basically 3 components of the research. They can't do 1, so they're going to beef up 2 and 3. I've looked at it. I think it's reasonable. The agencies are talking, but we wanted to bring it to the ESRC just so you can see what was going on. It's not really a decision-making thing for ESRC, but it's an info thing. So I'll let Gordon go ahead and take it from.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate you setting that up. So just for the benefit of everybody on the call, USGS has for several years been working on a project to understand the ecology of Hawaiian Hoary Bat on the east side of Hawaii Island. Excuse me. There were 3, as Dave said, there were 3 components to the study. One was to use towers and automated telemetry to track long-range movement of the bats. The second was to determine the diet of the bats and its relationship to availability of potential prey. And the third was to do focused studies of roost site selection and site fidelity. And in a nutshell, the first part just simply hasn't worked. We have spent 18 months dealing with a myriad of hardware, software, firmware problems, a lot of background noise, and perhaps contributing to that is that the bats just may not often fly high enough above the canopy to provide a good signal. We can come back to this if people want more in-depth details. I'm not the subject matter expert on this, obviously, but about 2 months ago, people came to me and said, this is just not going to work. We have spent hundreds of hours working on this. It's not going to work. So I said, okay, what's plan B? And so that was originally communicated to Fish and Wildlife and DOFA, and we've had one conversation with them. And now let me just go through what we're suggesting we do in lieu of automated telemetry. And I want to point out that really the first element of that was movement studies, and we will have movement information because whenever we catch a bat, we do put a transmitter on it and we track it as best as we can using handheld transmitters. We get information from looking at fidelity of bats between different roost sites, and so not giving up on the idea of movement at all, but I want it to be as forthright and come as early as possible to this group, just so people understood. So we're decommissioning the telemetry towers, and we're going to refocus our efforts really to look at more roost and diet studies in different kinds of forest areas, particularly more leeward areas, Komahama region of Hawaii Island, and focus a little bit more on high elevation work. Continue sort of refocused on the roost and guano collection work at high elevations, because that's going well. We'll have a lot of good information on diet and prey availability, and then continue the monitoring at roosts whenever we find them. And so that's it in a nutshell. I'm sure there's questions. I'll answer whatever I can. And again, if you guys want to have a more detailed discussion, that could be arranged.
Hey, Gordon, this is Melissa. Thanks for sharing the updates. First of all, I will say that I'm a visual person. And so for me, if I can see those things like the intent of the research and then what's been done to date and stuff visually, it's super useful for me. But I'll try to hold in my mind the things that you said. If I missed anything, just correct me. So the transmitter studies that you're referring to, what was the data gap that was trying to be filled with that transmitter study?
Mm-hmm. So the idea was yeah, sure, sorry. The idea was that we wanted to know, say, if we caught a bat, say at Haleakala, using that as an example, because I know you know where Haleakala was. does it fly over to Lapahoihoi? Does it fly towards Hawaii Volcanoes National Park? Where does it go? And we had thought, based on previous experience with the technology, that we could set up, I believe, half a dozen towers in various parts of the east side of Hawaii Island, and that we would be able to track the movements of bats across that large landscape. And that is what has not worked. We're still tracking bats locally. And then again, I'm sorry, I didn't come on deck with a presentation because I wasn't aware until yesterday I was going to be doing this. So I'm not necessarily ad-libbing, but so then the other parts are, when we catch a bat, we get guano. Guano is precious. I mean, bat guano is probably, in terms of the amount of effort it takes to get, and now it's probably costs more than platinum. We're using that for our diet studies. We put a transmitter on them. We track them to roosts if possible. We have other areas that either we know from our long-term work here, or people tell us if they see a bat roosting in a tree, they will follow it. We'll put up cameras to monitor that site and check the fidelity of the bats. So that's
okay.
Did I answer your question?
Okay, so the data gaps that have come up over the last 24 hours that we've been talking about are that we can't answer using acoustic studies are, for example, are there these seasonal shifts or daily shifts or that kind of thing in movement? And you were hoping to capture that with the transmitter studies. Okay. Secondly,
well, let me jump in. I think it's an important one. Acoustic studies don't follow individual bats.
Right.
So that's an important distinction. We thought we could be able to see, where individual bats went and how far they ranged.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so that gap, and then but the individual, like the roosting and stuff, this wouldn't have captured that to give guidance in regards to specific habitat management that could be done for mitigation, because those towers are telling you general directions and general shifts, but they don't give you the eyes on bats that would tell you which kind of tree they're roosting in and the height and the habitat type and the gaps and how they're using those. It wouldn't give you that information, but it would tell us about these potentially daily, monthly, seasonal, whatever shifts, right? Okay.
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate. Yeah.
Okay, and the major barrier to the major impediment you guys have run into is that it's you're not getting enough detections at the towers of the bats that you captured to actually be able to say something about movement.
That's accurate. Yeah.
Okay, and the total number of bats that were captured and had RFID, I'm assuming it's RFID, transmitters attached are what?
I think we captured about 40 or so bats. So that's a rough number, but about 40 or so bats in the last year. I don't remember how many we got last year.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so a substantial effort in capturing bats and getting transmitters on. You've got a decent number of transmitters on bats. It's just that they're not being picked up by the towers. Yeah,
and we do also, as soon as we release a bat, we have handheld, right? So we do get some local information, but not the large regional stuff.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's the end of my questions. That helps me understand what you were intending to do with this study, the kind of information we could have gotten from it, the impediments you ran into. So essentially, we're back to handheld, which is a ton of human labor effort to track them down, and still you get a reduced number of resites.
Yeah.
But maybe higher information for actually providing guidance for habitat management, as well as because you have an eyes on a bat, if it's roosting with pups or something like that, it can start giving us reproductive information in a way that the towers would not.
Right. This whole study was designed, to address multiple goals, and the large scale movement was something that at the time seemed like it was within reach. I'm by no means happy about the situation, but it is, we are where we are, and I want to be constructive and try and make lemonade out of some lemons.
Believe me, I understand the challenges. My lab works on Pueo, so I get it. It's really hard. So yeah, it's not meant as a criticism, but just the things that have come up and where people have said we don't have the tools available. I think it's important to talk about the tools we do have available, what they can provide us, and where the limitations are in our current available methodologies. I think it's worth at least clarifying those points. Based on what was presented in the bat workshop, you know, as far as guano and the diet studies, it seems like we're getting a pretty decent handle on what they eat, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. But again, our study was conceived to have geographic bounds of pretty much east side of Hawaii Island. By going around the corner, if you will, of Mauna Loa, Tokonahama will be in a very different terrain. Some advantages are apparently has a pretty good road network for tracking. It has a history of a lot of acoustic detection. So we know there's bats there. We're hopeful that we'll be able to find some zones where they, can do effective netting and capture them. And then perhaps even more effective handheld tracking.
I'll open it. I'll give one final question, then open it up for other people because I don't mean to dominate the time. But in your opinion, do we have, as far as the remaining data gaps, which we have so many, what are the most important ones? Do we need to continue chasing after diet, or do we know enough that there's actually more important information in regards to what this committee needs for better decision making?
Oh, I don't think I have the technical chops to answer that question. I'd be happy to be part of a discussion, but the bat is such a vexing animal. The good news is almost anything you learn is helpful. I think during the bat workshop you made a point for the importance of demographic data, and I couldn't agree more. And so, one of the reasons why we're looking at roost and diet are thinking about what are limiting factors.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, in regards to demographic data, population size, reproductive success. Yeah, definitely. Okay, thank you so much. I'll shut up now.
Pleasure. Any other questions?
Just one point of clarification for the background. For those of you who don't remember, this was the highest ranked project that came out of the ESRC BAT RFP, which I think was in 2016. So that is why this project was selected and how it contributes to our efforts.
Thanks, Michelle. Leah, look like you want to say something.
No, I was just happy that you answered all of my questions.
I can say from our standpoint, 1, 2, and 3 are all important. We'd really love to see more information on everything. Like Gordon says, this is just a species that is very poorly understood, and so getting more information on anything is good. One would be good, but then I think the roost ecology is really important and good for applied consideration of mitigation efforts. So I personally think, that expanding that piece of it has value. And I also think that the other thing that I like about it is that they're going to be able to expand into other types of habitat. So it's going to expand the types of habitat that were looked at before. It was going to be more, wet windward type, and now they'll be able to expand into some drier habitat. So I like that piece of it. So, I feel like in balance, it's going to all be good information.
Sorry, Gordon, I will ask one follow-up question. So the towers will continue to be up. I'm assuming, are these part of a broader network? I know these have been used for water birds. They've been used for other species for tracking them. So am I correct in assuming that these towers are going to stay up, but that there's just not a further effort to pursue them for bats, or what's the plan moving forward?
I think we're taking them down.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. Shall we say that once something goes up and the project ends, there's sometimes a tendency for scientists to litter the landscape, and then 5 years later somebody comes by and either hurts themselves or complains about a visual eyesore. So we don't have any, we're warehousing the equipment, obviously, and hopefully we can find an application for it. But we didn't want to just leave stuff out there with, basically being untended hazard, either visually or operationally.
I understand. And from discussions with Evan Paxton in particular, my understanding is that the towers, at least in the past, cost about $10,000 each, but there's a huge amount of maintenance required to keep them functional that wasn't anticipated at the beginning when they were developed. So I get it that if there's not an ongoing study, it seems like the recommendation is to take them down. There are, go ahead.
I think Evan has plans to keep one or two, and I'm not sure exactly which ones they are. I'd have to find out.
Okay. I know there are handheld receivers that, for example, on one project we're going to be trying out. It's still GPS, but you download it via a handheld device. And so that kind of removes that it's much less than $10,000 per device, and it removes the maintenance thing, but it does have a limited battery life for the device on the bird. So it only lasts for the life of the battery. From that perspective, but might be something to consider. I don't know whether they're small enough for bats.
Yeah. How do you know how heavy they are, the transmitters?
We're using them on Poyo, so obviously that's quite a bit bigger. I haven't done the exploration to how small they go. There's of course the trade-offs between battery life and size, battery life and mass, and so they may make them small enough and then they just don't last as long or something.
Yeah, that might be fine too. We'll look into that. Somebody will contact you for figure out what you're using.
Yeah, I think the take-home message is I really appreciate that you've gone the direction of doing individual level tracking studies. I think that's where we're at. There's a use for the broad scale island information for overall tracking of trends and abundance and number of detections, but to actually know the management actions we need to take, these individual high energy, high funding, high personnel studies, unfortunately, I think are what we need for actually getting the information for better decision making. So thank you for your efforts in this regard.
Doing the best we can. Sometimes I used to have a t-shirt that said, if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research. Sometimes that's actually true.
Okay. Thanks, Melissa. Any other questions? Observations, input?
This is Matt Stelmach. Can I have an opportunity to ask a question?
Sure, Matt, go ahead.
I'm curious, we've seen in the past that things are different from island to island, and I'm wondering if there's an interest in doing this on other islands, or if this is just going to be limited to Hawaii Island.
Well, hope springs eternal. I mean, we stuck at it because it seemed like we were progressive. It's almost like a, just you keep thinking sooner or later we're going to make this thing work. And perhaps with different technologies or a different landscape, a more open landscape, it could work. I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't. But the devil's in the details, and there's a lot of details between, what seemed like should work and the operational reality of dealing with a lot of different technologies. And we had, like at some sites, we just got drowned out by some electromagnetic radiation that wasn't apparent where it was coming from. But sometimes there'd be these background flare-outs. So. Yeah, Matt, I think I wouldn't give up on the idea, but I wouldn't bet the farm on it either.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anything else? Anybody in the crowd that wants to chime in? Not just the committee. Anybody's welcome to have a question or make an observation.
Is there someone monitoring the YouTube chat in case there are questions coming in there?
Yeah, I'm monitoring it right now. I don't see any questions.
Okay. Matt, as a committee member, my short answer is yes, I would love to see those studies on other islands.
Absolutely. It's a matter of, well, like Gordon says, there's the technical considerations and operational considerations, and there's also funding. So that's one thing about having
My
some.
thought was if you're changing direction, if other islands are being considered as you're expanding other areas of your research.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think for now, so we, believe me, we talked about this a lot. You know, one thought was, well, let's move the towers. And then, well, we still don't know if that's going to work. So, you know, we have basically 6 months of intensive field work left. And the decision was made to, you know, just basically cut our losses on the towers and focus on things that we know we can do. We can catch bats, we can tag them, we can track them manually, we can do the diet studies and the roost studies. And that's going to be valuable. And we believe that's going to be valuable information. And doing it on a different side of the island and in a different habitat should provide value-added information.
Yeah, and I guess perhaps part of Matt's question is, did you consider moving in your expanding to other islands? But I imagine that that would have a cost and logistics element.
COVID, you know, if COVID wasn't around, but you know, right now, thought of having people, you know, our crew's over here, our crew's on Hawaii Island, so setting up somewhere else and having people move back and forth. And again, with time requirements, you know, just to get site right of entry for sites is, you know, can take a while. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't take it off the table, but I don't think it's going to be part of this project. I wish it were otherwise.
Well, hopefully the methodologies you develop can be applied elsewhere, and so that can be a model that we can use. I mean, certainly we continue to gather more data.
Any other questions?
Thanks, Gordon. Appreciate
Okay,
it.
well, sorry I don't have you know, the golden the Holy Grail, but that's what happens sometimes.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks
Gordon.
much.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Okay, so moving on from that, the Kenai Industrial Park, Acaranthes HCP, we need to omit that from the agenda because we don't have anything from them. We don't have a report. So Koa is going to continue to work on that. So let's see, we have scheduled at 1 o'clock, Awahi HCP. I see George at the top of the list here. George, you want to go ahead and are you on and ready to go?
Hey, hello, Dave. Yeah. Oh, hey, hi, everyone. Yep, I'm ready to go. Yeah, if you guys want me to start, I can begin. Yeah, good. Thanks, Gordon. That was interesting to hear. You know, similar what we did for tier 2, 3 research, and sounds like similar issues. So hopefully we can improve some research design in the future or something. It did sound like, you know, USGS was still going to take the fatalities and try to get poop samples out of them. So it sounds like, you know, we will get insect data out of that. So yeah, just to, my name is Georgia Cow. I work for Awahi Wind. Hi everyone here on the nice upside down there, island of Maui, calling to you from Makawao here. I'm speaking to you today about the Awahi Wind Habitat Conservation Plan. This is covering our annual report review, fiscal year 20 up and some updates. This is year 8 of our HCP from July 1st, 2019 to June 30th last year. I got some other updates since then. Here's a little picture. Some of you have been up to this site. ESRC did a tour a little while ago, and you can see some of the plantings and what the type of vegetation what is the type of vegetation in the area. Let me see if I can advance this slide. Okay, here a quick overview of the project. It's a wind farm facility found in the Oahe area, Moku of Kahikinui or borderline Honuaula. A lot of our mitigation projects occur in Kahikinui and the Honuaula Mokus. The turbines are Siemens manufactured turbines. We have 8 at the site. They're rated at 3 megawatts, and we also have a transmission line that runs over the hill there above Maui Meadows and feeds into a 11 megawatt battery storage system. We've been operational since December of 2012. We have a ITP and ITL that's issued for 25 years. It expires in 2037 and covers 4 endangered species: the black-burned sphinx moth, Hawaiian goose, Hawaiian hoary bat, Hawaiian petrel. Koa did a nice job of putting together some notes, and a lot of this is displayed in that. Here's our take and the tiers. Real quick, looking at this, we're in tier 1 of petrels, Hawaiian goose. We're good there within those levels. We have no take of the Hawaiian goose. We just got our HCP amendment approved, and we're in tier 4. And for black-burned sphinx moth, yeah, I'll just give you guys quick updates coming up. So at the site, we do a lot of monitoring, post-construction monitoring. We do ongoing monitoring and bias correction trials we've been doing that for 8 years. Here's some of our results taken right out of the annual report, our CEF results, our CARE results, doing really good. Here's Mochi, also searching out at Kahiava. It looked like similar type of results. I was surprised. Yeah, I think upper Kahiava 1 had little different numbers there, but yeah, Kahiava 2 maybe same lower elevation type of dry vegetation. Our area, we do a lot of predator control. Vegetation is cleared, pretty much to the bare ground. Searching a large portion of the area, the fallout area. Bats, 76%, and birds pretty high up there. Yeah, the predator control, in the past years, this area is open for grazing operations. There's cattle, there's feral ungulate, like goats, deer, pigs. So sometimes we get some goats in some of the traps. But yeah, the trapping has been going good. The big difference, I think, from the years past is, implementing, putting in some cat traps. The footholds target the cats, and we have really high success removing cats using those traps. And I think that's where the carcass persistence really gets impacted if you can remove cats from a site, similar to other mitigation areas. Also, some of the results of fiscal year 20, we had 8 Hawaiian Hoary Bat fatalities, and our estimated cumulative take in the annual report was 58. That's using EOA, 80% credibility, adding indirect take. Everything is at 58. As you saw, this is still within tier 4. No take of Hawaiian petrels, cumulative take of 4 there. There was, one bat injury. Lucky it didn't turn into a fatality. Got rescued. That was a success there. But some updates since the annual report is we're doing some more thermal analysis. In the annual report, you saw USGS's technical report that was attached. There's towards the end of the report there, summarizing the results, and we are interested now that we have a bat deterrence installed. We're still interested in the bat behavior, and out of that USGS study, we still haven't seen a bat fatality. It's something that in Hawaii has not been observed yet on camera. I think as soon as we find out how a bat is dying at a turbine, it might help us figure out how to mitigate that a lot better. USGS, they're still performing bat genetic studies. We sent them our remaining 2020 bat fatalities in the August. Since the annual report, we had 4 bat fatalities in August, September. It's just speaking to the SEEF and the searching out there. One of the fatalities was just a bat wing, and the search was able to find that. So we're going to move on here to some of the mitigation success criteria for the NENE. Management funding was provided $25,000 to the Haleakala National Park Service. This is pretty much same numbers as last year. I don't know if they've, when I talked to them last, they kind of stepped away from this pen, but 10 gosling and 1 adult on the last check. And once again, no take of NENE. We did observe a couple of NENE at the site. I think band number 55 or 56, a pair of them, and but no take of the species. But it would be interesting to see where those birds are coming from. Blackburn sphinx moth. We did not find any on the site this past year. Restore 6 acres. Mitigation success criteria for this one was restore 6 acres of dryland forest in the Wahi Forest Restoration Project. This was originally to Leeward Haleakala Watershed Restoration Project, and Wahi Forest pretty much took over. They at the end of last year reported on outplanting 1,500 Aiea and the 10 Iliahi, little bit more acres than was required, and that's completed. We still do our surveys along the roads and translocate any BSM we find on the site. Also, we created this little fence exclosure near the office to house some of the endangered plants found down at the lower elevation. Hank was interested in putting a PEP species in here this past year. I think there's an Ojai now that he added on, Sesbania tomentosa, or no more tree-like Ojai. Looks like it's doing good. It's a good site, similar type of thing going on here with the A'ali'i. You see that kind of coming in and choking out that ground cover. Then Willy Willy and a lot of other dryland species in there. So yeah, moving on to the petrel, just to review the success criteria here is predator control was implemented within the management area and methods successful in capturing predators. This is ongoing. We're committed to this for the life of the project here. In 2019, we had 109 predators removed. Total predators removed since start of the trapping was 534 as of last fiscal year. We're working on the numbers for this year, but similar trends there. Mitigation efforts result in 1 more fledgling or adult than that required to compensate for the requested take of the required tier. This is ongoing. In 2019 annual report, there are 9 chicks that fledged. Total of 58 chicks that fledged so far from 2013 to 2019. The last annual report, where the hardest thing out of all the petrel and the bats, and I think you guys are getting there with some of the questions, is calculating net benefits. I think a lot of talk is focused on the impacts, the negative impacts to the species, but with all this mitigation going on, got to realize the benefits and what are the actual benefits coming from this type of mitigation. And yeah, we're working more with the agencies on that and how to calculate that. And you saw something presented in the HCP of how that could be done. Yeah, quick updates here. Additional boroughs found and managed again, and this past year's monitoring for. Sorry, 4 more boroughs found this past year. Biggest issue, I think, and talking to all the neighboring managers and projects going on in the area is the goats trampling the burrows. We're not in charge of removing the goats or managing the goats, but the best I can do is provide you the information. So here's a little graph and some information about the goat trampling events up at Kahikinui. And yeah, maybe one day we can do something about that. We do think, that's probably impacting, and speaking to all the managers, that this is the main thing that would, see some results. We would see some really positive results, some great increases in number of burrows or chicks fledged. But yeah, compared
George,
to
wasn't there supposed to be a fence going in around either all or a portion of the site at some point? I thought that was in process.
Yeah, I mean, I'll check with the agencies, but DOFA, maybe you guys have a update, or it's not really our responsibility, but
No, not at all. I was just curious because I know you're up there a lot.
Yeah, the last I heard, speaking with Andrea, they're working on some interior fences within the larger fence, focusing more efforts in the smaller fenced units. There's been a lot of issues with the ungulate and ungulate control, ungulate management in Kahikinui, mainly with the feral cattle and hunting areas and hunting. And I think with all the talk going on, nothing is really being done right now with the ungulates. I think it's been all put on hold. But this is a good information. I think June, July is when we see the highest, impacts to the burrows. Maybe if it was targeted that one hunting session in June or July could happen, this could be managed a little. Just some type of management would be helpful in the area.
That certainly tracks with what we saw with the DKIS site as well.
Yeah. So now you guys kind of know what's been going on. I mean, coming to you guys every year about this goat. So we do catch them in the footholds. That's a good thing. We caught a couple so far, so we are able to maybe remove some incidentally. But yeah, no, I'll leave that as we can come back to it if maybe I'll work. We're still talking to the agencies and working with all the different landowners and managers and trying to see how we can help out best. I think the last thing we did was help out with some providing some space for some removal of feral cattle. But yeah, we'll see what happens this year. So moving on to the Hawaiian Hoary Bat mitigation success criteria for a tier 1, was to establish a conservation easement for the Waiho mitigation area. This was completed. It was 132 acres. After this past year, I love conservation easements. Spent a long time working on one this past year, but it's just good to know that this land is protected forever. From landowner to landowner, and I heard a lot of talk about some of the issues with the actions happening on private land, but conservation easements I think are very helpful in protecting the mitigation actions that happen on the land and providing benefits to the species after a project is completed, such as ours. After the 20 years, this 25 years, this project, this site is going to be protected hopefully forever. The fencing and removal of ungulates were completed. We do quarterly fence checks. Everything is looking good. No damage to the fence, maybe some tree fall, but everything's looking good there. The vegetation, we did some restoration, some outplanting within the fenced area. This past year, we had some interest from a master's student out of Katia University to look at the some of the measurements. His master's thesis was shared with the agencies, but we're mainly interested in the measurements he was taking for the mitigation success criteria of koa height and canopy, percent canopy cover. And we'll look at his thesis. I think he's working to get published, but that information was shared with the agencies. With those results, we are meeting those mitigation success criterias of the tree height of at least 25 feet, or density of or canopy cover percentages. They're really high if you look at those results. Acoustic monitoring, part of tier 1 was some acoustic monitoring at the wind farm site, turbines 1 and 6, and that was completed. And we're still doing acoustic monitoring in the area, but not the same units, not in the same areas, but still got some monitoring going down at the turbines there. For tier 2 and 3, we did this USGS Waiho mitigation site bat research, and that was completed. There was a technical report that was put out. Interestingly enough, it overlapped with H.T. Harvey's study a little. Here's a picture of Kristen putting out a detector on the ranch property. In the H.T. Harvey study, they put out some detectors below Pumakua, all the way right behind Maui Meadows. So yeah, it's pretty interesting results. I still, out of all the tier 1 stuff, tier 2 bat research, it does seem like ag lands, are important. Working with the private landowners, and the ranches, I think, will benefit the bats, targeting those lands that they prefer. Since the annual report, some tier 4 updates here are for tier 4 actions. We're required to install hedgerows, ponds, and egress structures. Some quick updates, that's ongoing. We got so far 80 acres of fence line constructed, 30 acres of koa planted. The first pond completed, that was all done at the end of last year. The egress structures is pretty interesting here about the gosling. The ranch, they have a simple ladder design, but if Stephanie or you guys have better designs to protect other species, that'd be interesting to look at. Tier 4 bat acoustic study, acoustic and insect study is ongoing. Started some results here. Some February through July bat calls were detected. Range from a low of 21 to some detector sites at 11,000 over detections. Pretty in line with what they saw with the Waiho study. Here's in the picture is a result, the site, a detector location that was sampled in the Waiho study, and you see the insect trap, the pond, the acoustic detector. This is, I think, the 11,000, the site that pretty much has year-round bat activity. This is what bats want year-round. They based on some of the past studies going on. Leeward Haleakala occupancy and distribution studies ongoing. We actually just pulled the last set of data in December, and Joe, I think, should be on now. Joe's on the call. He'll have some quick updates for you, and working on the report coming out. Some pretty interesting stuff. I think the similar year-round, almost nearly year-round bat activity at some of the locations, and similar type of features. But we'll see what more detailed analysis results in. We were able to record the conservation easement for the land to be protected in perpetuity. It's awesome, perpetuity forever. It's completed this December 2020. I'm glad that all the work I do up there will be protected forever. No one can come back and cut those trees down. So that's awesome. Another quick result is USGS. They presented at the National Wind and Wildlife Conference there. That technical report is available and attached to annual report. But looking back, quick comment on the workshop and some of the available information. There's a lot of good tech data information out of these technical reports, and I suggest that they be incorporated into the guidance document. Quick update here for the conservation easement. These are the lands that were protected on the ranch. Some imagery there to the right. You see some of Pumakua and then what the type of habitat or vegetation was throughout most of the area, which is pasture, prime pasture. So really appreciate the ranch working with us, letting us take up some of that prime pasture, putting some hedgerows in there, planting some koa trees. And Joel, sorry, is Joel on? That's mainly my portion. I wanted to just go through give Joel some time to give some updates on the work, the research he's doing with us.
But George, I have some questions. You want me to wait till the end of the whole thing or ask you now?
If Joel's on, maybe he can talk, and then he might answer some of your questions. And if not, I can answer. Joel, you on?
I'm here. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep. Yeah, Joel.
Yeah, so just a few updates. I mean, the map here that George shows is their tier 4 mitigation sites. So we are, George and his crew are doing all the on the ground work out there, but we're assisting with just data management and analysis of the call data. And so this map just kind of shows a depiction, kind of the variability in detections across those 38 detectors. And this is for the period, this is February through July, I believe, of last year. That same basically overarching period that George mentioned, upwards of 11,000 detections at a few of these locations during that period. So that's all the data that's been analyzed at this point. The next batch will be coming up here soon. So there is quite a bit of variability here. It'll be interesting to see how this changes over seasons, and with the density of these detectors out there, how that varies in accordance with the troughs and the other actions that are going on. So we can look at it a little bit in comparison to some of the leeward stuff as well. And so that particular area kind of falls near our western sites here, and this is just kind of an updated map from that leeward Haleakala study that we conducted. These are our sample sites, and again, the size of the dot here kind of corresponds with the level of activity we see, just for distribution wise. And we had detections at all of the sites across the study area, with by far and away the most activity at the mid and upper elevation sites. The range there, it says 3.27, but that's just the bottom of the bin. I think those 4 or 5 largest dots were all in the 8+ category, average detections per night. So fairly substantially larger than the rest of those sites at the mid and lower elevations. And I think as you get down close to the highway and lower down towards the water where it's drier and whatnot, we tend to see the lower numbers as you go up in the elevation. It's moister, greener, more trees, more bat activity. The same going to the east as we got around the slope towards the Cowpo store in that country. We started getting a little bit higher levels of activity, even down low, potentially maybe due to just being a little wetter side of the study area there. So this study last year was pretty hampered by COVID because all of these were remote detectors and helicopter access and whatnot. So we don't have all that data analyzed yet. And I think George mentioned that we just got the last detectors removed just before the end of the year, given the access issues out there. So we're working on getting all that pulled together. I'll be working on a report here in the very near future. So I think we just got the last data card to process those results.
Hey, Joel, a super brief comment on that previous figure. Is there any possibility when it's presented next time, if the binning of the numbers makes it just a little bit difficult to wrap the brain around? You mentioned that there's a bunch of sites, or there were a good number of sites with above 8 detections, but just like avoiding decimals on the binning. I know that's probably the default one, but if it could be, you know, less than 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and then if there's something that you think is of significance, like, oh, there were all these sites with above 8, just bin it so that those pop out a little bit. It would make it much more intuitive. Sorry, just a quick comment on that. Thank you.
Sure. And yeah, that's no problem. And I was thinking the same thing. It's just these numbers I was just working up as of yesterday. So I just wanted to get something to share with folks. So it's largely consistent with what I presented last spring in terms of distribution. And interestingly enough, if you move on to that next graphic, George, this isn't quite the full data set because we haven't analyzed it in a seasonal basis, but this is for the first 3 seasons that we collected data. So last summer through midwinter, with the black or the blue bars being the lactation period or summer. And as we move across to the orange bar at each site, that'd be fall, and then the gray bars being winter. And unlike on Oahu, where we're seeing dramatically or pretty substantially higher activity levels during the lactation period at pretty much all of our sites, wasn't necessarily the case here. Some of the sites we're seeing consistently high and or higher levels of activity during that late fall and winter period. So we'll see how that plays out as we get the rest of the data from late winter into the spring factored in here. But just caught my eye as a little bit of interesting, I guess, comparison to some of our other data at this point. Yeah, and with that, I guess I don't have a lot more to share at this point because we're really just getting the last of the data wrapped up. The study essentially concluded last year in its formal state, but George is planning to continue monitoring some of the detectors, and we've been working with DLNR and Lance over on the island there to redeploy a few detectors and keep them running, and helping to support on the data management side of that. So hopefully, although we won't have a full 2-year data set, hopefully there's a means to capture a second year to look at some annual variability here as well. So although it will be a reduced site, I think we're hoping to maybe have 10 of the sites or cells continue with some level of sampling. So.
Yeah, just wrapping up the project, we just put some cores back in where the detector locations were that the landowners didn't want the detectors to continue running. Kalpo Ranch, the state forest reserve lands. There's a couple landowners that are still interested in the data. So, I just want to thank them and all the different partners that participated in this study. This is a bunch of different landowners and types of land, co-op pasture, green canyon. Those are our private land. And you talk about private landowners finding about endangered species on their land. They seem like they're interested and want to know what's on their land and what they can do. But yeah, that's about it. Kavika, I know you had a question. I don't know if it was answered, but
No, you had your slide about success criteria, and it's similar to my comment with when Namako was presenting for KS. Could you go back to that, please? It was the one about the trees, outplanting of aiea trees. That's a pretty impressive amount of aiea trees, 1,500. So again, I'm not sure if the success criteria is actually outplanting a number of trees, but I think for the HCP, I mean, not HCP, ESRC as a committee, we all need to be conscious that the success criteria should be survivorship or some kind of other goal, because you could outplant 1,500 and they all die and they check off a box. Permittees could. So maybe George, could you just clarify what the specific success criteria was relating to the aiea trees?
Yeah, just funding the 144,000. We've gone above and beyond with that. Created our own little 1 acre site down below, outplanted, worked with some of those endangered species, not required under this success criteria. But we still work, with the species. We've gone out with Art and helped him do some vegetation control. We're in some discussion right now about some of the tier 4 lands are bordering his project and how best to move forward with some tier 4 mitigation on bordering his lands.
Because I remember, I know we had some discussion in one of the meetings about adaptive management in case of like a fire or some disease outbreak in the hedgerows. So I'm just wondering if there was some kind of commitment to maintaining this habitat, or if outplanting, you checked off a box, and which is, if you did, that's not your fault. But as the ESRC, I think we need to have success criteria for some kind of survivorship or habitat creation. Michelle, do you have any comments? You usually have something smart to say when I say stuff like this.
No, I agree with you, Kavika. I think that there's room for adaptive management on all of this.
Looks like Maria is chatting but not to us. I don't know. I can't.
Yes, the success criteria was the outplanting, was just the outplanting. So they checked the box. So it's a comment to apply to future things.
What was the success rate on the 1500 IAA?
Yeah, Art kind of reports and manages the information for that, and yeah, the last report I think was attached to our annual report. You can look closer at that one. I'll reach out to Art and try and get you a number of what's still surviving.
Yeah, I brought it up because IA is a tricky tree, and I haven't seen a super high survivorship of that that genus in general. So, if our long-term goal is actually creating habitat for the sphinx moth, then yeah, just have some concerns, but not that you guys have done anything wrong. I think ESRC needs to be a little bit better about how we approve these HCPs in this regard.
Yeah, it's real tricky. We have seen outplanted IAEA fruiting, and they have collected seed from those outplantings, and there have been some natural recruitment of IAEA. So, if it's a stable population, stable reproducing population, I do think so. The number in that population might be questionable, but it's
okay. That's awesome. So next time you present, George, if you could have some pictures of the naturally recruiting and regenerating IAEA, that'd be super awesome. I don't think I've ever seen that.
It's in the annual report. I think last year they performed it, but yeah, let me work on finding more updated photos, and I can go through the annual report, see if I can find a picture.
Okay, thank you, George.
Big picture, I also think there's room for ESRC to think carefully about what we do want to see for mitigation for black-burn sphinx moth moving forward.
Right.
I do think that there's some question marks about what that could or should look like. Whether outplanting IAEA is the right strategy. If it's not outplanting IAEA, then what do we do?
Yeah, for the BSM, we have observed them on IAEA in the outplantings. But it's a good question, Michelle. The tree tobacco does provide some good habitat, and I don't know if we're trying to help out BSM, if we're trying to kill that tree tobacco and what we're replacing it with, and most BMPs are recommending removal of tree tobacco. There's maybe a better way to do it.
Yeah, I like going the IAEA route rather than the tree tobacco.
I do as well, but we've probably got a couple of different projects coming down the pike where the removal of occupied tree tobacco is required. So how do we want to think about those?
Well, I have seen IAEA be outplanted.
Yeah.
It's not. I just was curious what the success rate was. I'm sure you know, it's probably not stellar, but it should be something that you would anticipate that we would ask that question, George, for the future on the success of any of the outplanting
Yeah.
kind of actions.
I'll check with Art, you know, but they work with so many species, and they've shifted a lot to a lot of fluvial work this past year that, you know, he probably has better numbers on the most recent species he's worked with. And I think, you know, he does a lot of good work with all those different species, and I'll try and get a more targeted answer for the IAEA results. But we drive past it pretty much every day going up the hill, and we see the site, we see the trees, you know, doing really good and producing fruit, flowering. I don't know, seeing IAEA forests full of flowers is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's a nice plant. So
I
George,
have a question for Joel. George, could you go to Joel's slide showing the, you know, the dispersal of those sites on above your site there, you know, the regional study?
Sorry, right to it, but don't be too hard on Joe. I asked him to pull together some quick data analysis, and he's going to do a more thorough one later. But yeah,
I'm not going to be hard on him. No, don't worry. No, not that one. The one showing the yeah, that one there. So my question is Joel, I mean, you know, if I'm reading this right, you know, the lower detections certainly are along the coastline and higher detections at higher elevations. You know, that being said, is, you know, there've been quite a number of fatalities at the site, which is, you know, in your lower range right there. I mean, that seems pretty suggestive that potentially there is an attractive feature to the wind you know, towers themselves. That may be part of what the problem is, particularly in such an open landscape. Does that make sense?
I guess it could.
Or it's a hypothesis, at least.
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly. I mean, the wind project is just to the west, not very far at all from 104 and 40 down there.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it may potentially it's attractive to a small number of bats there. I mean, it's not so attractive that it's pulling bats from afar, I wouldn't think, unless I'd have to look and see. Actually would be interesting to look at some of the historical acoustic data from the site specifically compared to what we have here, right? And that might get at a question like that a little bit more.
Yeah.
If they're similar numbers.
And then a bigger question really is you know pertaining to this study as well as the Oahu study that you've talked about there. I mean, one of the challenges we've always had is, you know, where are the best places to site wind farms, or better yet, the opposite side of that question is where to stay away from. And you know, it seems like this kind of information may be extremely useful if that could be part of a pre-planning process to say, okay, here are areas with, you know, high occupancy at least, that may be, you know, considered to be areas that are more potentially vulnerable to higher take of bats if facilities are sited there. Is that sort of a reasonable logic to at least explore?
I mean, it's a logic that you hear about, right, in the siting of turbines in a lot of places relative to things, whether it's, you know, on the mainland, we deal with that a lot with eagles and, you know, trying to document the highest use places, and, you know, a lot of discussion around whether or not those should be kind of off limits based on that level of use. I mean, I guess it makes sense thinking about it. But there's a lot of caveats, I guess, that go into it in terms of, especially, yeah, at this point, I think it'll be really interesting looking at the effectiveness of the deterrents and whatnot that are here. And as we saw yesterday, how effective those were as well. But yeah, I mean, that's logic, right? Avoid the places with the highest numbers would be a good thing, but.
Yeah. I bring this up because, I mean, it seems like, you know, in most cases, I mean, the main criterion is, you know, good wind speed and good consistent wind speed and a willing landowner in terms of where projects have been sited. And, you know, we've always sort of struggled with, you know, after the fact, we're having to deal with, you know, how do you mitigate for, you know, take that occurs in these areas, whereas if they were sited in different places, it may be less of an issue.
right? And I'd be, taking that approach, I'd be curious to know what it's like across the rest of Maui, right? I mean, taking that approach, then the wind farm is probably in a pretty good place based on at least this study area. It'd be, who knows what the level of take might be if it was,
Up higher.
the upper slope here
Exactly.
versus the lower slope. So
Anyway, no, I mean, just looking at your map, just sort of spurred on those thoughts. So
right.
thanks for your thoughts on it.
I had a question. It seemed like on this project, the numbers for the bat fatalities were higher than the projects we saw yesterday. I was just curious, I mean, in interpreting that, obviously in places where mitigation is going well or populations are doing well, we expect to see more fatalities because there are more bats. And we can imagine a worst case scenario where there are no fatalities, but it's because we killed all the bats and there's no more bats left to kill, right? That would be a worst case scenario. So just because we don't see mortality at a site or fatalities at a site doesn't necessarily mean we're doing a great job. It can be interpreted multiple ways. So I guess I'm just trying to know how to interpret the number of fatalities that I'm seeing here versus in the projects we saw reported yesterday. Is it because there are more bats in the area, so we expect higher fatalities? Is this higher than expected, lower than expected?
Yeah, I can speak to that from the adaptive management plan standpoint. We're monitoring what our acceptable take levels are to, stay within the levels within the permit and the license. And we have some triggers that, require us to do some additional minimization actions if we exceed the threshold value, if our baseline fatality rate exceeds our threshold value. And that's very useful in guiding adaptive management, giving us, this past year, that's what we use to monitor the take and install the bat deterrents. So that's was a requirement if our take was exceeding those values. Yeah, compared to other sites, it'd be interesting to look at all the different sites data and see what the numbers really mean. But yeah, we're mainly looking at our site.
So Joel, this is Loyal. When you compare this to say Oahu or Big Island and the activity levels that you're seeing here, how does that compare to say, for example, Oahu?
Well, the levels here are higher across the board than we generally saw on Oahu. So most of the sites on Oahu, even our higher level sites, are if we're looking at the same kind of over the full year sort of metric here, the numbers there were topping out around 4 calls per night, whereas here we're upwards of 15 calls per night on average. And just as you were talking about that, Melissa, the numbers here at Oahu, so at our 2 lower sites that are closest to the project there, we're looking at maybe about a half a call per night on average, or 1 bat call every couple of nights. And compared to the sites on Oahu, our detector sites that are most proximal up to Kauailoa and Kahuku in that area, they were in the 1 to 5 category for annual. So the numbers here are actually maybe a little bit lower than those because those are more in our hotspot on Oahu. Difference being that the landscape here is more wide and open where the wind farm is. And I don't know if there's, correlation there between, the turbines being in a wide open landscape versus a more forested landscape where they potentially would be more attractive. Talk about that sort of thing on mainland too, out in, the Corn Belt where you have towers sticking up. So, but just looking at that in terms of relations, the numbers here, even though the bat mortality was a little bit higher, probably potentially a little bit lower in terms of activity levels than in some of the wind sites on Oahu.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, from an abundance perspective, you would actually expect less fatalities here. If all other factors being equal, you would expect less fatalities here than on the ones presented yesterday where fatalities were 0.
All things being equal, if it was just based on activity rates, yeah, I think that's the case. Although I caveat that a little bit that this is a partial, not quite a full year data set that we're looking at here for Maui, but
Joel, those are ground-based acoustic detectors, right?
they are.
And if I'm recalling correctly, the literature has shown that ground-based acoustic detectors are poor predictors of fatality rates. Is that consistent with your assessment?
That's true. Yes, we've done a lot of work on that and have found really that, yeah, that is not a good predictor of fatality rates pre and post con. That is, anyways. So.
If you want to, I would suggest to the ESRC, Marcos has papers that have done thermal monitoring at both of these sites, the sites that you're talking about. And in the most recent paper he published, which was on thermal monitoring from Oahu, he speculates as to differences in bat activity at the two sites. And it's a good resource if you're interested.
Thanks, Matt. And Joel, would you mind also going through what are currently considered to be the better predictors of mortalities? I know there's a couple papers on it, but if you wouldn't mind just walking through them real quick.
I probably not. I'm not sure what is the best predictor, right? I mean, historically, we've always leaned on doing pre-construction acoustic surveys, but through lots of analysis, that doesn't appear to be, correlative. And maybe it's partially due to this attraction theory that what you see beforehand doesn't correlate to what you see around the turbine after you put a turbine there. So I don't know. I mean, the best thing that we often lean to in assessing risk is what's been going on at other sites, historical mortality data as a predictor of what you're likely to see nearby. That doesn't do you a lot of good if you don't have other projects close by, right? But in a lot of cases, people are building in similar locales, and without that, we often look at just similar habitat and features within at least a regional context. I don't know of a magic bullet yet.
I think the way USGS interpreted risk in their technical report is interesting, and risk doesn't always equal fatalities, but usually with the thermal you can determine how close the bat or some type of distance the bat is within the rotor swept area, how long it's within that area. That could lead to give you information on the risk going on at the site. But as we saw in the USGS technical report, with all that risky bat behavior, we did not find any fatalities on camera or with the ground searches. So, even though we see risky behavior, it might not mean bat fatalities on the ground.
Thanks, George. One last question for you. Have there been any internal conversations about the relative efficacy of deterrent technology at Kauailoa versus what we're seeing here?
Not comparing sites, but for our site, definitely seeing a reduction in take, reduced our BFR level. We had some initial take when the units were first installed, but since the August fatalities, we haven't had any fatalities. Pretty quiet fourth quarter, no listed species, just one minor bird. But yeah, the efficacy of the study, I spoke with Marcos, and ultimately we're trying to prevent fatalities. We're still seeing with some of the thermal data that there is some still risky behavior occurring within the risk zone, depending how you want to define that. But the initial results, it seems that the bats aren't hanging out in that area as much. But yeah, determining the efficacy, I think, bats on the ground is going to give you the real numbers there. If we're finding any fatalities, is this deterrent system really working?
And George, this is Loyal. So since you're getting some potentially benefits from the deterrence, what do you think, or what is the projected likelihood of exceeding your permitted take?
Yeah, with the units and as of the last report, we are not projected to exceed the take, especially with the adaptive management measures, adaptive management plan implemented, the deterrent units. Right as of right now, you know, who knows what this year could, what the results will be, but if we're seeing similar results as Kauai Loa or other sites with deterrent units, you know, we would expect definitely staying within our permitted levels.
I want to circle back. Matt, I really appreciate your comment in regards to how to interpret this stuff. I think the way that the discussion took place in regards to the detections and the fatalities was around thinking about siting. And typically from an ESRC hat perspective, by the time it gets to us, the siting is chosen. We have no control over that, other than maybe new proposals that come across the committee. But I think if there's any further comment in regards to how to interpret the relationship between number of detections and fatalities in regards to what's happening with overall population trends, are we getting more fatalities because there are more bats in the area, and so we don't, you know, the population's doing fine and we don't need to worry as much, versus all of a sudden there's no fatalities and it's because there are no bats in the area, not because of our deterrent measures. Are there data to help us make that end of the decision making, which I know it's interrelated to the siting stuff, but it's a different spin on it from the way we think about it. I don't know if Matt has comment, or Joel or George.
Yeah, so the paper that I referenced from Marcos that looked at the thermal monitoring at Oahe, his assessment was that the behavior of the bats, the utilization of the sites was different at each site. So at Oahe, the time of night was a little bit later, suggesting that bats are coming from a distant location, stopping at the site, and then moving on to somewhere else. And whereas at Kawailoa, they saw detections almost right at sunset, meaning that the roosts were nearby, and then they disappeared quickly. So the bats were transiting through the site on their way to foraging grounds elsewhere. So different site use characteristics, and that is likely influenced by habitat, likely influenced by the available prey and the surrounding habitats, and you know, the way that bats generally use that landscape. And when I look at Joel's figure that he has up on the screen here, to me that suggests that bats are typically utilizing the upland habitats, and that the lower habitats are visited but less frequently. And so just a different, you know, Kawailoa is pretty densely forested, a variety of habitat types, but it seems like the bats are likely passing through that site, whereas bats are flying down to the coast in this situation and then back up to the forest.
That's
Melissa, I gotta.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment. You know, with sighting, I think it's, you know, pretty tricky because bats are pretty much everywhere. But a lot of this data would be good for minimization measures. You know, if we know when to implement the best minimization measures. You know, something interesting that we've been trying to investigate a little more is daytime bat activity. What's going on with the bats during the day? We've been seeing some bats flying around during the day. You know, maybe spoke a little bit with some other bat people about it, and yeah, they've observed similar, especially over pond features, water features during the daytime hours. But yeah, that's you know, with minimization, I think sighting, like I think wind farms and endangered species can exist. So, you know, the way the wind farm operates in that area, I think that's where the best, you guys give the best recommendations, look at the best information available, and, you know, determine how to minimize the impacts, mitigate those impacts.
That's useful because the permittees, from a decision-making perspective, they're going to think about their individual sites, and it comes to us as individual sites and individual reports. But the island-wide long-term information is going to be super important for ESRC, because we actually should be able to both focus in on a specific permittee, but then also expand and look across how this is impacting the overall population. And so both types of information and I think I raised this issue yesterday, we really need the island-wide monitoring long-term in place without gaps to be able to see how the sum total of projects are impacting bat populations, especially given the nuanced explanation, which I really appreciated from Matt in regards to, hey, the bats may cruise through a place and you get a higher mortality because there's a lot of bats, but they're roosting elsewhere, so your detections are low. You did it so much better, Matt. But anyways, that nuance was very helpful. And again, I think highlights the importance of island-wide monitoring for informing how we think about these specific projects. Thank you for the discussion. I appreciate your input.
So this is Loyal. There was a paper that came out in September of 2020 that, you know, did some looking at the pre and post activity that was seen. I think I may have sent that to the ESRC folks. I can show the graph if you want me to share the screen on that, but we don't have to do that. It just shows that there's a correlation, but it's not that there's more bats seen after construction than pre-construction. So the actual numbers aren't compatible, but there's still a relationship. The more, generally speaking, the more bats you found pre-construction, the more you would see post-construction, but it was not a one-to-one. It was a multiplier.
George, you said you've had 4 bats since the last reporting period?
Yeah, 1 bat wing. I mean, four bats.
Oh, okay. Whew. I was thinking that you had 4 observed since then.
Yeah, 4 observed.
Okay, 4 observed, which with EOA is probably somewhere, what, around 18 or 19-ish?
Cumulative, we're right around the tier 5 mitigation planning threshold. I think it was with our last cumulative adjusted take sent out letter, we were at 66 in October. We're just trying to work through those numbers and see what it is. You know, no fatalities since the October report went out, but we have to run the analysis with the full year data set to see what that number is going to be. But yeah, it was 66 in October.
Okay.
And did the evidence of absence project that out for the life of the project?
Yeah, it's a requirement now. We report our threshold value and our baseline fatality rates. I mean, the threshold value is constant, 6.45. I think the BFR dropped to about, yeah, I don't want to say right now, but below that. I got to look back at that letter. The agencies have it. But we did notify, you know, knowing that we are soon to be into the tier 5 planning phase, which is about 75% of the take. So after 66, we're in the planning of tier 5. So we notified the agencies, we've initiated conversation about our tier 5 planning. And so far we've received a letter showing that DOFA has acquired the Kamehameha parcel. I think the next step is to work through a management plan with them for that tier 5.
Yeah, it seems like tier 5 might be coming up quick there, George. We should make sure that we're ready to go and implement.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking with any way you guys want to support. I think Lance, you know, is we have the detector. So right now we have about 3 detectors from our leverage study that we gave them, and we wanted to use at least 2 on the acquired parcel to start collecting baseline data. I think the last issue was working out access with the leasee. There's still a rancher leasing section of that parcel, and just working out some access. And yeah, Joe kind of talked a little bit about supporting I think also they were just waiting on some funding, procurement things to work through.
I have to admit that I'm pretty concerned that we're having this level of take with deterrence running, but I really appreciate Oahu's being on the ball on the mitigation and really trying to get things up and running as quickly as possible, as well as your commitment to minimization. So thank you. And we're just gonna have to keep watching it.
Yeah, you know, we got a semi-annual meeting coming up, semi-annual report. So, you know, I think we meet quarterly. So some big changes from past years is we meet a lot more regularly with the agencies, you know, by Becca. But Michelle, are you stepping more into Becca's role now? I mean, or are you guys filling in? Maybe I think it's Leisha is more going to be back on, and yeah, I think Lauren left, but we'll work through the, you know, the staff transitions too. I think that's the big one.
Yeah, on the federal end, work through Leisha, and then I think Koa, you're taking it from the state side, yeah.
Yeah, for now, until we hire the coordinator.
Yeah, but we'll keep everybody in the loop. You know, we're constantly reporting on the fatality rates, threshold value. There are multiple check-ins on that. So, and when we implement adaptive management, you know, we have some timelines and requirements on those types of things. I think you know, a lot of what was discussed and you know, past so far in the meeting is a lot of it is addressed in this habitat conservation plan amendment. You know, with the triggers and success criteria of when to trigger adaptive management. I think it was really thought through nicely for our plan.
Thank you, George.
Okay, any other questions? Comments, thoughts? Okay, well, thank you very much, George. Appreciate it.
But thank you guys. Thanks for listening. Thanks for giving me the time. Appreciate it. And yeah, have a good rest of the day.
And Joel, nice. Thank you. Okay, that brings us to the end of our agenda. Is there anything else we needed? Was there something we wanted to push off to the end of the day, or did we take care of that? We might have covered it.
We said that it need to be on the agenda for a future meeting rather, because it wasn't on our schedule for today.
Right.
Maybe
So I did go back and look at the Oahu restoration report that I had in my files, and of the 1,500 IAEA, looks like 65 to 75% success, varying slightly between the 6 different sites. Sorry, random note, but circling back on the previous question.
Okay.
I'm assuming we don't need to have an agenda item to set agenda items for future meetings. Would it be possible just to take a few minutes to talk about things that came up from today that we want to follow up in subsequent meetings, so we can, I know things come up over and over again. It would be nice just to put them on the agenda, address them in a targeted way, and maybe not. Sure. Maybe we could avoid quite as many sidebars on the other things. I don't know. Maybe that's impossible to do, but.
No, that's fine. You can talk about that.
Go ahead. You got suggestions, Melissa?
I guess one thing that is continuously on my mind is how we are looking across projects to see how individual projects impact overall well-being of species. And while I am told when I ask those questions in meetings that those are supposed to be addressed by the state and federal people working on the HCPs, it might be nice just to have an agenda item to talk more specifically about how that happens. Or yeah, when when we have the opportunity as ESRC to actually review that. I would appreciate personally seeing when people present stuff, we already talked today about asking them up front to state the success criteria and then how they're meeting them. And I would really like to see that as a starting slide every time we have a presentation, so that it's really clear what our decision making is for a particular presentation, and how to evaluate it. And I don't necessarily think it's the permittee's job, but in light of that, it would be useful to maybe have a slide talking about how that project feeds into the overall impacts to species. Particularly for, I know every project's a little bit different as far as some have very, very minor things for a given species, other ones have a lot, but it varies across projects, and it'd be useful, at least for the species that are highly impacted by a project, to have that kind of a brief overview ready to go. So we can have that as part of our discussion. Is that, am I asking for the moon? I guess I want to just check in.
Honestly, I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, each project's kind of independent, right? So we can't necessarily tie them all together in a discussion item.
No, but when we're making a decision on an individual project, we somehow have to gauge how, 50 bat deaths contribute to overall well-being of bat species, right? And so, and the mitigation, we're doing math in our heads, and the math is too complex to actually figure out. I mean, what is 100 deaths? If you mitigate and grow 200 somewhere else, then do we care that there were 100 deaths? Theoretically, no, the math works. And so I guess to me, the numbers have to be in context, and the context is, I think, more the job of the state and Fed side to evaluate how it fits into the bigger species stability or recovery picture.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I fully support that. I think the larger context is really important, and it's important to realize that we are the Endangered Species Recovery Committee. We're not the HCP Safe Harbor Committee.
Yes.
And I know, from previous discussions from Linda, and maybe Linda, you could chime in, is our mandate is not just simply to look at the specific projects, but it's a specific project within a broader context altogether. So I think that is very important, and particularly when it comes to, looking at the biological impacts of, for example, projected take at a site, how important that is in that broader context. It's not just on that particular site. So I fully support what Melissa's saying.
Yeah, so there's two things. One are just the updates, which isn't really a decision-making thing on the part of the ESRC. So we're talking about updates to existing permits. And then I think maybe what we, to help answer these questions, it would be a discussion with the agencies and a presentation by the agencies on how things are looking across the board, cumulative take across different projects. And then if we have the data, then things like, like the West System, how does the West System survey and what they're showing, how does that fit into the context of having multiple sites where there's take and also mitigation, and how do those all work together?
Yeah, we've certainly taken advantage, of the larger picture view, for example, with seabirds on Kauai, with all the surveys that have been done there, and that fits into our thinking in terms of how to look at impacts and also mitigation sites and so forth. So I think that's very appropriate.
And then when you consider like the Kamehameha School's request of looking at reducing some of their numbers, we've got to have an understanding of what those plants are doing elsewhere at other state sites or other private land sites.
Linda, do you have any insight?
I mean, I think that's correct, that that you do need to look at it not only with regards to that particular HCP, but the larger context, because the framework of 195D is that HCPs are supposed to enhance the likelihood of recovery of the species. That's one of the requirements of an HCP. And so it always has to be framed in the context of the recovery of the species as a whole. And no HCP is responsible for recovery. I think we've had that discussion ad nauseum, but it needs to, help and not hinder the ability of the species to recover.
Within the context of the take that's permitted in any particular area, right?
Yes.
Because I mean, ultimately, you could have take going on by some project and a mitigation program that everybody looks at and thinks, oh yeah, they're mitigating for the take that they're responsible for, and yet the species could still be declining overall, and yet that particular project is going to be meeting its obligations, right?
Yeah, I really found it useful in the Nene presentations, the ability for people to say, oh yeah, actually we've got this total number on the island. This is this proportion of that that's represented within this site. Even just those numbers were useful. I realize we don't have those numbers for most species, but to the extent possible, it was certainly useful.
Yeah, it is interesting to toggle up and down, not only by site, by island, and statewide, so toggling back and forth. Some, Nene is really showing that it's very difficult to maintain them pretty much anywhere but Kauai. We're really struggling with the overall population sizes, but it's not on the brink of extinction, Kauai's cranking them out. So yeah, how do we manage? Part of it's our legal obligation, right? If we're permitting somebody to take animals, then we have to make sure that we're mitigating for those. And so that's one piece. It's kind of a small piece of the overall bigger picture, right? And then the agencies ultimately are trying to recover species overall, and that's a much bigger, much broader landscape, both literally and figuratively.
Yeah, it's never been so apparent to me as sitting on this committee that the impact that mongoose have. As soon as you look at Kauai compared to any other island and you see the numbers back to back, it really highlights that.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, for Nene, look at Nene.
And seabirds.
Well, yeah.
I'll just say that on the federal side, it's absolutely our obligation to look at take requests within the context of species, populations, trends, and recovery. And we do that and define it in our decision documents. Those documents are part of our process, and there's not just one of them, but typically several of them related to an HCP. And it's not just in the ability for the project to meet Fish and Wildlife Service issuance criteria, but also in our analysis that the project is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence or survival of the species. I think that we have done that as a committee, particularly as it relates to bats, and that bat workshops are a part of that effort on behalf of the committee to not just look at one project individually, but look at to make sure that we have a common understanding of what's going on with bats to the extent that we can, and to use the best available information to inform the development of projects and what the impact of those projects mean within the context of the species. Do we have all the information that we want to? No, but we as a committee have committed to looking at that information and doing the best that we can with the information that we've got. We have not necessarily done that with all other species, partially because of the time and partially because the agencies haven't identified them as major issues, although I can see us potentially needing to do that with seabirds at some point.
Yeah, I don't think we've done that with the annual reports very well. I think we've tried to do that with the initial permitting, but I don't think we've necessarily done that very well on the annual report stuff. And when we said what are the things that we were looking for new agenda items, well, you had said, Michelle, earlier that you would look at the take and the mitigation offset for the Nene, right?
Yes.
So that's one that we wanted to look at for sure. And I think that You know, I said that it would be nice for us to talk about how, if we wanted to have some sort of a listing spreadsheet or whatever of the actual requirements for each of the HCPs or safe harbor agreements, so we know what actions we should be looking at. That's kind of implementation monitoring, which, by the way, was one of the things I did for the Northwest Forest Plan, as to whether or not what is in the HCP is actually being implemented. Whether we want to do that, whether the agencies are doing that, or what they are, and if the agencies they're doing it, can we get copies of that so that we can track the progress of the actions that are required. And one thing I think would be maybe useful to talk about is how we think we want to look at for changes to the baseline that Namaka was talking about on stuff like that. Yeah, I do have some concerns about that for taking off, say, outplanting plants that die. Then what does that do when your conservation actions that you're doing under the safe harbor is to do more outplantings? You know, do those things count, or do you only count then the natural regen from those? So I just have some kind of maybe more academic or philosophical questions on that whole concept. So those are 3 agenda items that I could pick out for the future.
I know we want to have an academic and larger philosophical conversation on that, Loyal, and I agree with you. Just so you know, though, for the purposes of the Kamehameha example that you just provided, we approved in that safe harbor agreement that we knew that they were going to do an updated survey within the first 2 years, and that we anticipated them updating the baseline condition based on those new survey things. So it was clearly spelled out. You know, we'll talk about it offline, but that one was a specific incident. If they had outplantings that had mortalities after this, then it would not fall within the category that was identified in the safe harbor agreement. Details.
Details, always.
Are there any other suggested agenda items that people want to make sure we got on our radar screen? I know we got a bunch of stuff that, you know, we got notes on and whatnot. We had made some notes, but so far I just have the one from Melissa talking about looking at recovery more generally through the agency perspective.
I actually had a thought listening to Melissa's comment, though. One of the things that I've been talking about with my team internally is having a template for annual reports for certain projects so that we can have all of the information that we actually want to see up front and clearly defined. It may also be warranted to have a template for presentations so that we get the information that we need out of each presentation quickly. It puts work on staff, so I'm hesitant to recommend it too strongly because I know what that means for our teams, but I also think that it could alleviate some of the burden on the committee.
I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, it also reduce the uncertainty. Obviously, it's stressful to a permittee if they come before the committee and they have no idea what kinds of questions are going to be asked of them, and have to scramble for information. So this helps let them know up front what, not every question we could possibly have, but the important things up front. That's great.
Would it be possible to charge a task force to help the staff pull that together with a couple of members of ASRC on it, just for a short stint?
Well, I'd like to offer, did we see a problem with the presentations?
I personally don't see a problem with them, but I think that, for example, some of this information that we said we'd like to see, like what are the success criteria, the years of implementation, and just kind of where you're at in the progress timelines. Some of those things up front would be really helpful since we're reviewing so many at once, rather than having to go through everybody's report in the moment to try to find some of that information. Is that what you were referring to, Michelle?
I agree. I think there's some boilerplate things that would be helpful to have. I don't think it would take a tremendous amount of staff time to extract, but of course that's easy for me to say.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just say that my initial thought is that, like I said, internally, we've been having a conversation about really uneven reporting. It's not that anyone is trying to do a great job or a poor job. They're trying to report what we think that they want, and just having a template informs the permittee about exactly what it is that we consider to be the most important pieces for evaluating both compliance and the impact, the biological impact of their taking and their mitigation or conservation actions, and putting it in a form that's easy for us to understand. And then from a very logistical standpoint, putting the information in a form that we can then put into our databases so that we can track it a little bit better rather than having it just be in narrative form. So that's part of this. But if it also helps to have a standard set of questions that we want people to answer in the presentations, then that also is helpful.
This is Glenn. We do have a template for annual reporting in the BAT guidance as an appendix.
That's good.
Good. It sounded to me like Jim was volunteering to lead a task force to develop such a list. Is that right, Jim?
That's a negative, yeah, but since I'm already on another task force, but you know, I don't think it's going to take more than one phone call to really, you know, sketch it out, quite frankly, and just, you know, help staff put it together. And building on what Glenn said, you know, because, you know, there is that template already, but, you know, let's go beyond bats.
And actually, if you keep it to 2 people, you don't even need a task force. You guys can, 2 people can just talk to staff and you're fine. You don't even need to send China or anything else like that.
Okay. Anybody want to take the lead on that?
Thank you, Michelle.
I will do that.
Well, see, then that way you can make sure that the federal template and the state template are similar.
Silver linings, Linda. You want to join me?
I'm happy to review whatever template you have just for content and make any recommendations if that's useful.
Great.
Good.
Sounds good. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you, Michelle and Melissa.
Yeah, anything else? Yeah, well, thank you guys. Really appreciate it. And
been productive.
Yeah, it's good on time, very productive. That's good. But the reports for the most part are good. And I don't know, my observation is it seems like we're doing pretty good. I mean, from the early days of these HCPs, when, you know, we're really shooting in the dark, it seems like they've really gotten sharpened up, and there's a lot of really good work going on out there. It also seems like, to me, my sense is that the minimization work has been, for the most part, pretty effective. I mean, it seems like, you know, Hawaii was one kind of outlier, but some of the other ones, it seems like they've been pretty good over the years. Cross fingers. I don't want to jinx anybody because we did get one come in for Kahuku this year where we didn't have since 2014. But, you know, the adaptive management along the lines of minimization, ultimately minimization is the holy grail, right? If we can just avoid taking animals, that's the best. And so it seems like the applicants are doing a pretty good job of that. That's just my sense.
Hey, Dave, recognizing some of the questions that came up in today's discussion and knowing that we're going to have a KSHCP discussion in March and then likely a KUC discussion later this spring, it might be good for us to think about having a specific meeting just on sort of the current state of seabirds across the board, not talking about any individual project, not talking about take, but just what is the current state of our understanding of seabirds across the main Hawaiian Islands. I just think it's going to be a discussion every single time that these topics come up unless we get ahead of it.
No, that's great. And I've noticed, I don't think seabirds have gotten enough attention. I think there's a lot more that we can do. One thing that kind of caught my attention today was when George was talking about goats trampling seabird burrows. And I've heard other reports say on the Big Island, specifically on our land, that I just haven't had a time to follow up on, that it just sounds like there's, you know, people aren't attuned to seabirds. I think there's a lot of seabird nesting effort out there that just gets, you know, trampled, you know, both literally and figuratively. Just all the birds get wiped out and nobody really notices, you know, kind of thing. Whereas if we can focus on some of these areas and a little more targeted seabird management, then we can really help to improve you know, the survivorship on some of these colonies. So that would be good. I would like to focus more on some of these terrestrial and especially these more high elevation colonies that are maybe sort of out of sight, out of mind, but there's a lot of potential there for seabird recovery.
Not that I'm looking for anything more to volunteer for, but I enjoy working on an agenda for something like that.
Okay.
I think it would be super helpful. Sorry, so because, you know, even hearing the story of the Hawaiian petrel that was, you know, not on the Napua Makani HCP, you know, understanding what's going on with the birds on Oahu, and then knowing there's more happening here on Hawaii Island too.
Yeah, there's interesting things happening all over, and have a little more focus on that would be great. And, you know, seabirds are so manageable. I mean, we know what the limiting factors are, and it's just a matter of having the resources to be able to go after it. But, you know, if we can identify some sites and look at some limiting factors and see if we can't find the resources to address some of those specific sites and specific colonies, I think we could do a lot for birds. And like you say, there's big questions about seabirds on Oahu, some of the forest nesting seabirds, and then also West Maui Mountains. Seems like there's birds there that they know very little about. So yeah, it'd be nice to go after some of that.
Dave, is the offshore wind stuff likely to come across ESRC's agenda at some point, or is that outside of the 2 mile radius?
Well, I just sent an email to Scott Glenn yesterday saying, hey, we need to get together and take a big look at this. You know, where are you guys going with the State Energy Office? What's your plans? What is you know, in the context of renewable energy, what's a full build out look like for wind and solar, and then what do we anticipate we're looking at in terms of potential take, and what are your plans to mitigate for that? So we're going to be having that discussion. Offshore is a whole new thing for me, and it would depend on where they site it. You know, if they're outside of 3 miles, inside of 12, outside of 12. So I'm not sure all the I'm not up to speed on all that regulatory for offshore wind, but it is certainly an issue on the horizon.
My understanding is there's something out for comment right now. So I was just, it sounds like it's not some way off in the future thing, but that something has happened enough for it to be out for comment. And so, yeah, again, because things tend to be pretty far along and have a lot of investment by the time they get to us, I think it's good for us to anticipate some of the things that are going to cross our desk. And in cases where, I mean, kind of like the bat thing came out of nowhere and now we're playing catch up with offshore wind, I can imagine that being another situation where we're playing catch up the way, you know, we are with seabird declines that were caused elsewhere between 93 and 2013. So catch up isn't fun.
And Michelle or any of the feds, are you familiar? What's the name of the federal agency that leases ocean? Yeah, because they're, I thought they,
energy management or something like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I'm not aware. They had made a run at something and then they withdrew it. So I don't know what's going on now.
I honestly have not heard anything, but if I do hear something, I'll pass it along. Regardless of the state's jurisdiction and whether or not it would come to ESRC, it would come to us for impacts to TNE species.
Yeah,
and then
get these guys to quit dropping hand grenades in our lap, you know? I mean, the current system, they're gonna hit a regulatory wall here pretty quick. It's been a heavy lift to get the permits out that we have, and you know, we're gonna have to have a much more robust all-around system and approach if we're gonna be able to do much more permitting.
I appreciate you taking the initiative of reaching out to the state energy office, Dave. I think that will help us think through some of this at a broader scale.
And I've mentioned it before, but I know, and I don't know, Kavika and Melissa, if you guys have been into Lava Lab at UH Manoa, but they worked really closely with the energy office, and they have this whole 3D map of the state that has the entire projected renewable energy build out. It's quite like eye-opening. So if you guys know Jason Lee, go to Lava Lab and ask to see those maps. They apparently take them on the road. The energy office does. So it kind of, I mean, a very high level view of what the potential future of development looks like.
Will you request that as an information session at an ESRC meeting?
Yeah, that would be an energy office request, I think.
Yes, for anything you want. Yeah, we're somewhat constrained right now. We're going to be bringing a new person in. Hopefully we'll have a little more capacity to be able to get, but we really need to get in front of this stuff. Yeah. And, you know, a lot of these things, it's great to talk about renewables and, oh yeah, we're going to go 100% renewable. That's great. But, or, you know, we're going to be zero carbon offset or whatever. But man, taking that to scale is way different than, you know, being at 1%. And so, you know, when you started, I remember we were at a COA symposium a few years ago and they started talking about, you know, planting COA trees to offset carbon impacts, and the scale of tree planting was mind-boggling. It was huge. And so we need the same thing is going to go for energy. You know, if you're really going for 100% renewable energy, well, we need to know what that looks like, but it's significant. The land cover from solar panels, amount of land that's going to take up, you know, impacts to things like poyo habitat and that sort of thing. And then the wind, overall wind impacts, and how many turbines are you talking about, and how are you going to site those, and how are you going to mitigate for impacts? There's a lot there that needs to be addressed, and they can't just keep coming and dropping these things in our laps, because it's going to become impossible to deal with without some foresight and pre-planning.
I think the big thing to stick a pin in is that when I've chatted with some of the wind siting folks, when they're coming from the mainland, they're used to looking at potential overlap in critical habitat, designated critical habitat. Most of the species that we're seeing impacted in our situation, they're not going to pop up as, I mean, it's not going to catch the issues that we're going to see. So thank you, Linda.
Very California model.
It was, yeah, it was a Western area of the US folks. And they were trying to develop a tool for Hawaii and were wondering about endangered species. And when they said, oh, this is the way we go about it, and they said, that's not going to catch them. And I don't know where it ended up. It was just one conversation. But I think that's important to stick a pin in, is that if they've got these gigantic plans they've already made and invested a lot of money in, and they're not taking into account the kinds of endangered species impacts that are going to happen either we're going to get bowled over from an endangered species perspective and we're going to start seeing a lot of stuff going extinct, or they're going to hit roadblocks and there's going to be frustration on both sides. So thank you, Dave, for your leadership in getting ahead of that. Great.
The other thing that I think at some point we need to sit down and talk about is just really review the whole mitigation stuff. I'm constantly surprised at how underperforming a lot of the mitigation is. And I have worries about that. Even for things that we know a lot, like we mentioned even in this set of meetings the last 2 days, that they're geese. We should be able to do geese easy, you know. It's still a challenge. And when we look at the plants, for example, you know, there are very few really, really good successful plant mitigation actions. Very few. So we do need to kind of look at that and think also how we want to be able to document, validate the good mitigation when it happens. Again, we talk about that with bats quite a lot, wanting to get a handle on that. But what do we really need to do to be able to lock some of this stuff down so that we know what we're doing?
Yeah, kind of along the lines of that. I mean, it kind of fits into what I'm talking about. So it's been so difficult to permit, right? And you know, starting a project from scratch and the time lag and all the algorithms, trying to get you to some point of catching up with take that's been going on for years with no replacement is really, really a difficult position to be in. So just FYI, I've also got a couple of, we've got a couple of bills being introduced to authorize the department to do conservation mitigation banks. So we have a conservation mitigation authorization for marine species, and Linda's helping me out with this a bit, kind of trying to point me in the right direction, but we don't have authorization to do terrestrial-based conservation mitigation banks. And if we could get to the point where we actually had credits on these species and money could be put up front, and agencies, organizations, or individual landowners or individual investors could begin to get these credits in place up front, and people could just come in and buy credits for, say, you know, I need X number of petrels, or I need X number of bats. And so I think that would make the certainty a lot easier on both ends, both on the permittee side and for us in terms of permitting. So just FYI, keep an eye out for those bills. I think there's two of them. I think, I'm sure exactly, it kind of went in at the last second, but one bill I think is trying to modify the marine statute to include both marine and terrestrial, and the other bill is just to authorize a terrestrial conservation mitigation bank. I don't know if Linda has anything to add to that.
Yeah, and I think that sort of dovetails onto another issue. I mean, in terms of, you know, we've through the BAT workshop and even in the revised guidance document, we talk about research that's really needed and what are the things that are missing for bats, and the same thing goes for some of the other species too. You know, we're very pleased to see the results of the island-wide occupancy study work that Joel is doing, both on Oahu and then also the regional on East Maui. But both those projects are ending, and we're not going to have that data. We're not going to have any new data. We had a great opportunity through mitigation, you know, research, you know, through mitigation as part of mitigation, but that window is closed. So it's how do we keep the momentum going to really foster getting the funding, getting the support necessary for some of this critical information that we need to have. I mean, you know, when it's gone, you know, but we need to figure out a mechanism to keep that going, other than just, oh my gosh, somebody decided they're going to do that study. Isn't that nice? Well, I mean, if we can be a little bit more proactive in pushing that along, that would be really useful.
No, and that's the plan. What I'd like to do is look at these, for instance, the West System studies, and just say, you know, what's it going to cost to do this overall on every island, and then see if we can get different applicants that would benefit from that data to buy in. So if you have, you know, 10 applicants or 10 projects on an island that could all share the cost, and then maybe some of the cost could be borne by the government too. And that could kind of fit into the mitigation bank type strategy too, where, you know, maybe the government's fronting the money and then trying to recoup some from applicants. But, you know, it may be the type of thing that if projects see a benefit to that, and there's also a cost effectiveness benefit for them, you know, so it's cost effective versus the alternative of them trying to go their own way on some sort of mitigation. If we could have larger, more island-wide monitoring systems in place that people could buy in to on a cost-effective basis, I think that would be give us better data and hopefully be you know, cost-effective for folks that are paying for it. And you know, the government's interested in this stuff too, you know, so it's not like all the applicants have to carry the ball by themselves. They might have a certain amount of interest, but the government also has some interest too. So if we could get some funding, you know, through government agencies to help maintain a system like that too, that could relieve some of the pressure on say, you know, just projects, ACP projects or something, having to try to carry the ball by themselves on that.
Yeah, no, but I mean, ultimately with mitigation, I'm getting back to Melissa's broken record, is we need to know whether we are actually producing something new to offset what was taken. And I think that's a really key part there. And you know, once we get to that point where we can actually do an action which will lead to a mitigation offset, that's where we want to be. And that would, you know, fit very nicely into a mitigation bank type of thing. But in the meantime, there still are some other, you know, background type of information studies that we need to have, such as that long-term monitoring and so forth, which, you know, we've couched as being sort of a step towards getting to that mitigation. We need to go there first. But, you know, that's not necessarily giving us that production of new bats. Bats in that case is an example. So somewhere we need to think of, you know, how can we get this larger context of that kind of monitoring work, where that fund can come from. And like you say, some of that could be agency, but you know, I'm not sure where else we can get it. Department of Energy, you know, Fed Department of Energy may be a source also at some point too, particularly if alternate energy, you know, gets the big push that we're hoping this new administration is going to have. So I think that's an opportunity too. But, you know, again, I think this is something we need to think about, because like I said, you know, once Joel's studies are done, you know, he's done. And we need to figure out how do we keep something like that going where it's needed.
So I think it's important to distinguish between monitoring and research. And I realize that it's both information. And the question is, what's the value of information? What are you using it for? So in this case, what I think is really important is that we need the island-wide monitoring of bats is to determine whether there is an individual and an overall impact of the take occurring at specific sites. And so from that perspective, because the information given from a single site on the amount of take is not enough to help us determine how that is impacting the overall population, if every applicant or permittee pays into a pool that helps maintain the island-wide network for monitoring to make sure that the collective of the projects is not overall impacting it, that might be a way to go. Because I think it does feed back into the question of helping us determine whether these are effective HCPs or not. Yeah. And actually the same listening towers, if you get effective AI going, could help us listen for all of these species, the seabirds, the bats, anything making noise, to help us long-term monitor the impact of wind and other energy development on our endangered flying populations.
Yeah, and that fits very nicely with, I guess, how it's set up right now. If I'm correct, Dave, is that, you know, a portion of a budget for a project goes into helping the state, you know, support the administrative costs of doing what we're doing. And so it could be a similar kind of, you know, that's part of the overhead of doing business, if, you know, for an HCP or a safe harbor.
Yeah.
Can I provide some input? This is Matt.
Yeah, go for it, Matt.
I think that you guys would probably see a lot of buy-in from permittees and new applicants if you relate these to the recovery criteria, like how do we get these species off of the endangered species list, for one, and then two, if we can really pare down, like there can be a big gap between the wish list items, like, you know, I want to have year-round island-wide monitoring for all the endangered species, you know, forever. And there can be a much bigger difference. Like I thought about this a lot for bats in particular. And so when I think about this for bats, like how many stations do we need? Joel had some input on that, like maybe 85 for Oahu instead of 100. And then if we can focus on a particular season to pare down the level of effort, both in terms of the monitoring and the analysis, because those are your two primary costs. So maybe just monitor in the peak season and find ways to make it as cost effective as possible. You're going to get a lot more buy-in, you know, on these types of projects. And so differentiating like the wish list from the have-to-haves is something that will be critical. And then relating that back to recovery, you know, if we can draw a clear line, say, okay, you know, if for example, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife current standard for documenting recovery of the Hawaiian Hoary Bat is in fact what the target that we're going for, we say, okay, if we document the Hawaiian Hoary Bat as a stable population on all islands for 5 years, we're going to delist the bat. I think you'll probably see interest from more parties.
Yeah, it sounds good. Yeah, it's similar to the, like, for instance, the stream monitoring effort. I mean, they don't monitor every stream. They stratify their monitoring effort and they build a model that allows them to build a water model across the watershed. And so they shouldn't, yeah, you could figure out how to stratify your monitoring effort here and build a model that would, you know, be informative as to what's going on with the population overall. Well, it'll be something to work on going forward, for sure. Maybe working with the West folks and just see if we can't build something, you know, see if we can build a model, you know, what would be a model, like you say, you know, a good enough model, and not, you know, maybe we need a Volkswagen instead of Cadillac, but, you know, something that would inform us and give us a pretty good sense of trends.
Yeah, David, one of the key things we're going to do here as we work through this analysis, and I've emphasized to Leanne multiple times, is really thinking about taking our new insights gained and looking at what would be the best or most efficient study design to continue this effort forward, or a similar effort forward. So we had done something similar 5 or 6, however many years ago at this point, power analysis of that sort. But we were really drawing on really kind of wild guesses as to what detection probabilities and things were. So that's something we plan to look at and strategize on. So
great.
So we'll have more to discuss there later this spring, summer.
Excellent.
I want to briefly say thank you to Matt for focusing on recovery. It's a focus of conversation that we need brought up more often, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Any other? Anybody else want to throw anything else out there? Any other information or questions?
Just checking, Cole, you're watching the live feed questions. Nothing coming in there.
I'm monitoring it. We got no questions in the chat so far.
Okay, well, it's 2:20. We had suggested ending at 2, but it's not a hard and fast. Just that was kind of on the early side. So if there's nothing else, maybe we should adjourn, unless there's any other last thoughts or comments that people want to make.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Okay, do I have a
I'll
second?
second that with discussion. Thanks to everybody. I think it's been a very productive meeting.
Yeah, thank you much. And thanks for Koa did a really good job, and Afshin, and I've been working with Koa and Afshin in the background, and they're doing a great job keeping it going, and Glenn. And we have I think we're going to be having a person coming on here soon to replace Lauren's position. So that'll be great, add a little more capacity. And we can keep moving this thing forward. We've got some interesting discussions coming up, and we'll be working with all the partners trying to move the whole thing forward. Endangered species recovery is our ultimate goal.
So we are.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Mahalo.
Good to see everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, we're adjourned.
Take care.
Perfect time.